Hali Kilbourne is a research professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. Much of her career has focused on better understanding Atlantic climate variability over recent centuries. She specializes in coral-based reconstructions of past surface ocean conditions, which has led her to her interests in the connections between low and high latitude climate variability, and specifically the connection between AMOC and Atlantic multidecadal variability. Over the last 3 years, she has co-led the U.S. CLIVAR AMOC Task Team 5, which brings together paleoclimatologists and paleoceanographers studying AMOC on multiple timescales. So today she is here to present a recent effort from Task Team 5 as part of the AGU Special Collections entitled Perspectives on the AMOC System, Linking Historical and Modern Views of AMOC. So we are very happy to have you here today. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. So first, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. This is very much a manuscript in process, so please, we welcome your feedback. Al Wanamaker has been my co-lead on this manuscript. He helped get the band together, and we early on broke up into 3 primary working groups, and so Dan Amryan, Marlos Goes, and Malte Jensen have been leads on those subgroups. So I want to acknowledge their leadership there. A lot of the new figures here were produced primarily by Marlos Goes, Wei Liu, and Noah Rosenberg. So with that, I will say let's get going. So the global balance of wind, diapicnal mixing, and eddies control the main dynamics of meridional overturning circulation. These factors, with modern basin geometry and modern background climate conditions, really set up the mean AMOC with which we are familiar in the modern day. But what happens when we change the background climate conditions? Of course, that's a major question of future AMOC, because we are perturbing the climate system. And the reason why paleoceanographers have something to say about this is because we actually look at what the system did under past background conditions that were different from today in order to gain insight into the potential behavior of the system. So on the largest scale, there was no AMOC before there was an Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic opened up about broadly 75 million years ago. Modern AMOC really began only after the Isthmus of Panama closed and the Pacific and the Atlantic no longer exchanged water in the tropical region, and that occurred about 2.7 million years ago and coincided with the onset of Northern Hemisphere glaciation. That Northern Hemisphere glaciation had quite a bit of impact on AMOC, and many sources of evidence indicate that there was a shallower AMOC, or excuse me, I should say a shallower North Atlantic circulation that had extensive intrusion of southern source waters during cool periods during this global glaciation. And during warm periods, we were more like today. These are figures from a review paper by Jean Lynch Stiglitz in 2017, and it really is a great summary of sort of the state of our understanding of changes to AMOC over glacial periods. But the Holocene, I've highlighted here in yellow, has been this relatively stable period. And what happens in the Holocene is really we have modern conditions. We have modern background climate conditions, modern boundary conditions, and so thus the processes that occur are processes that we can see today. We have modern observations to study seasonal to decadal scale processes, but where paleoceanography really can contribute is better understanding of the lower frequency variability, multidecadal and centennial scale variability, because we've got the longer records that can address these time periods. So what are some major questions studying most recent AMOC variability on these timescales? Really, there's 2 big issues, and one is, has AMOC in fact slowed down in recent centuries as claimed by a series of pretty controversial papers indicating that there has been a substantial slowdown of AMOC, say in the last couple of centuries. The other question is, does AMOC variability cause multidecadal fluctuation in North Atlantic temperature? So there's a lot of potential drivers of AMOC variability on these time scales, forced and unforced variability. And really to answer these questions, to really understand the variability and what's driving it, we need paleoclimate proxy records that provide the length, that can interface with instrumental data so that we can understand the signals that are relatively small compared to those glacial, interglacial signals that we see in more traditional paleostratigraphic proxies. So that sets up really this project, and we wanted to gather the existing paleoclimate proxy data that are relevant over this time scale and sort of demonstrate their utility. There was a bit of a mantra that started during a meeting. I think it was a side meeting at AGU a couple years ago, where we said, what do paleo records have that instrumental data don't? And it's really the longevity, the length of those records. And so in an ideal world, we would have some natural archive that records the average meridional stream function at all latitudes. And then we could compare this proxy AMOC with natural archives of all the forcing variables, and then we would have all the answers. Unfortunately, nature does not divulge her secrets so easily. So we have to work with what we've got. Paula Mofa-Sanchez led a data compilation and review paper that was part of this series. And that was where we started from. She and her team compiled all the data that was available that had at least 4 age control points in the last 2,000 years, because age control over this time scale is vital. If we don't have age control, we really don't know a lot about the temporal evolution. And then they also required that records be at least 100 years long, and that there be a minimum resolution of 100 years per sample. So these are your high resolution records of recent variability in the North Atlantic, and broadly defined, because they did not censor the data as to what variable is being reconstructed. So we looked at this as a starting point and said, okay, well, we're going to take those records, add some new records that meet the same criteria, also add low latitude records, because the earlier effort had set a lower a latitudinal cutoff, and so we brought in a lot of coral records. Obviously, that's my specialty. And then with the coral records, there's a lot of data that are 100 years long, but actually don't go into the 19th century. So we added that the data have to extend before 1900 to be useful as a proxy that extends our instrumental data. What variables exist in this large data set? There's a lot of variables. Most of them are sea surface temperature during one season or another. The signal may be mixed with seawater oxygen isotopes. Sometimes in some places that's directly analogous to salinity. Other places it's more things like ice melt. There were some proxies for sea ice concentration or sea ice cover. There were some benthic records of bottom water temperature. There were thermocline records of temperature and salinity. There were paleoproductivity proxies, and changes in water mass and balance of polar versus subpolar water. There were some bottom water velocity sortable silt records, and also at least one record of iceberg presence, so ice rafted debris. So these are all variables that we can reconstruct with our proxies, but the vast majority are sea surface temperature records. So we looked at the records that were available, and we looked at them with regards to their resolution. And there are nearly 100 records here, and there's a good subset that are fairly high resolution. And we decided to focus on those highest resolution records because that's where our best connection to instrumental data is going to be. We'll be able to sort of calibrate over annual timescales and interannual timescales, and that can help us better understand the lower resolution data after we have this the high resolution sort of better connected to the instrumental data. So we wanted to do sort of a first, excuse me, I should say that once we pared down to the highest resolution data, then we were down to just sea surface temperature and combined sea surface temperature oxygen isotopic composition, and one bottom velocity sort of a silt record and a biological indicator of the presence of cool water. So we're looking at changes in water masses at that one location. So basically, it's mostly SST. We had 37 records left after our criteria were fully applied, and when we cut to interannual variability, these are the sites that we had in our data set. And we wanted to do some sort of first order analysis. Since it's mostly SST, we asked, do the data contain useful sea surface temperature information when compared to instrumental SST? And can we relate the variability in that proxy data to important modes of variability in the Atlantic? And then can that data tell us something about the variance in the system from a frequency perspective? So in order to look at these questions, the first question, really, we did a joint sea surface temperature and proxy analysis of the variance using a singular vector decomposition. So for those of you who need the math, we basically had two matrices of SST and proxy, A and B respectively, and we calculated the covariance matrix, decomposed it into singular vectors, and then we calculated the expansion coefficients to determine the time evolution of the spatial modes determined from the previous step. And then we can reconstruct those spatial modes by projecting the expansion coefficients on the spatial modes. So in this case, A is used to reconstruct the mode of A, and B data are used to reconstruct the mode of B. But if you do it heterogeneously, you can then get a reconstruction of the sea surface temperature modes using the proxy data. And so that's what we're looking at here on the right. So the green dots in the first row are the proxy data locations, and the columns represent the joint SVD of those proxy data with 3 different sea surface temperature data sets. So we use the Hadley Center, HADSST, ERSST, and the Kobe data products. The rows are the different modes. So SVD mode 1, mode 2, and modes 3 or 4. So let's look at what we see. Basically I'm going to describe the temporal plots here. The red is the reconstruction of this mode using only proxy data. The blue is the reconstruction of this mode using sea surface temperature data. And so essentially the sea surface temperature is the target in a way, and the proxy data would be the reconstruction that you could then extend through time when you didn't have the instrumental data. So the first mode is a very low frequency mode, and it has a spatial pattern that is centered in the subpolar gyre with another mode or another center of action along the east coast of North America, roughly sort of where the Gulf Stream is. So we have this dipole between the Gulf Stream and the subpolar gyre. It shows up in all three data sets and has a very low frequency signal. The second mode is much more multi-decadal in its temporal variability and is also much more hemispheric in its pattern. The third mode has what looks to most of us as a very typical NAO tripole pattern of sea surface temperature variability, and it has an interannual temporal variance. So the patterns are similar no matter what choice of temperature data set that we use. And using the proxy data is a very good, captures the variance of the mode that would reconstruct it from SST alone. So the proxy data have a lot of information. And really I want to make the point that any individual proxy record has a lot of uncertainty associated with it. But when you have a network like this, they can have a lot of information and then can be very powerful. So a question is, what are these modes, and are they related to what we suspect they are related to? So we looked at the sea surface temperature. I should back up the blue line against against indices of processes that we cared about. So the top one, we looked at the subpolar gyre Gulf Stream index, so the difference between subpolar gyre and Gulf Stream temperatures as an index of temperature variance in that region of the ocean. That we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And we the SST mode certainly correlates highly with that index. Similarly, we looked at an index of multi-decadal variability in the Atlantic sea surface temperature index using the Hali Center data, and our second mode of SVD mode actually matches that very well and correlates very significantly. The third, and in the ERSST, it was the fourth mode of variance that we found correlates significantly to the North Atlantic index. This is the station-based Harel index. And so we suspected that the spatial variability is a familiar pattern, and indeed these can be linked to processes that we care about. What is that top mode? So we're hesitant to call it AMOC, but certainly we did a multi-model comparison, a multi-model correlation between annual mean SST and AMOC strength in the model, and came up, and what comes out is a spatial pattern of correlation centered in the subpolar gyre and the Gulf Stream. So it's very definitely AMOC related in the 20th century. And the question is this something we could use to reconstruct AMOC in the past? It's, I think, a question that still needs to be figured out, because this pattern essentially may not be representative of AMOC in the pre-industrial era. We may be looking primarily at a global warming signal. And to demonstrate that, we did the same analysis in last millennium runs of multiple models, looking at and found a similar but actually quite a bit different spatial pattern when we correlate SST to AMOC. So that basic dipole still exists, but the rest of the basin shows a very different pattern. So this is something that needs further investigation to try to make robust fingerprints that we can use to reconstruct AMOC. So essentially, in the future, we need to extend these. We want to extend these time series back in time, explore the influence of changes in the data availability, because our proxy network is not stable with time changes. And ideally, that we'd be able to expand to other variables. If we have networks of thermocline temperature, for instance, that would be great. So there's a lot of potential in doing this sort of work. I want to do a short sort of foray into exploring the data from a frequency perspective. And so we actually did that, and we had to put some further constraints on the data. We cut it to the actual annual resolution data only. And we wanted data sets that were very long, so 150 years was our minimum cutoff. We wanted to look at the spectral slopes. And why would we want to look at that? Essentially, it's a useful way of testing if the statistics of variability in models and observations are similar. And how do you test the last millennium run if not with proxy data? Because we don't have instrumental data of the last millennium. So we wanted to sort of look for different regimes of variance, potentially at different latitudes, trying to see if there are areas that have variability that are different from different areas. Because we wanted to compare to the instrumental record, we are constrained but the frequency that we could look at. So we looked at the 5 to 15-year period band and characterized the spectral slope of those periods. We did it in proxy and instrumental data. The instrumental data was the Hadley Center data, and that's in sort of a gray, dark gray, represented by the error bar there. And certainly when we plot it against latitude, we have big error bars, but the basic pattern of proxy overlapping the instrumental data seems okay. To look at it in a different way, we actually mapped this, and so we see with the instrumental data, the subpolar gyre clearly has a steeper slope, indicating sort of more variance at lower frequency. That's something I'd need to look more about before we write this stuff up. And interestingly, the proxies here are filled with their spectral slope over the same period, and they generally match the background instrumental data. And so this is something we're sort of currently hashing out and iterating before the final manuscript. So just some final thoughts. Paleoclimate and paleoceanographic records really provide information about the system behavior outside of modern day boundaries and over longer time periods than the instrumental data. With recent anthropogenic forcing, we're basically pushing things outside of that pre-industrial boundary conditions. And our best bet for understanding AMOC variability on these longer time scales of multiple decades to centuries lies really with leveraging these longer paleoceanographic proxies that are high resolution and can interface with the instrumental record. And such analyses, like I showed examples of today, can hopefully serve as the basis for more mechanistic studies that test the relationship between AMOC and potential drivers over recent centuries. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you so much, Hali. So we'll take the next 5 to 10 minutes for questions. All right, I see a question from Andrea Schmittner. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Hali. Very nice talk. Very impressive. Very great to see this data compilation. I have, I guess I have two things. So the one is you showed that the pattern is different if you correlate it with AMOC in the models for the pre-industrial and the post-industrial. And I was just curious about that. Maybe you can talk about it a little bit more, and maybe if you have any speculation about why that would be the case.
Yeah, so let me get that plot up. Yeah, I gotta find it. Let's see. Yep. There. Okay. Yeah. So we didn't remove the global warming signal. And so that's likely what's driving this negative correlation over the globe in the more recent period. And so the earlier period in multiple models doesn't have that large global warming signal, that large trend. And so we see more of honestly a north-south hemisphere dipole here that doesn't show up when you've got a large trend. Wei Liu did this analysis, and he actually has plots of the individual model results. And actually, the multi-model result is very it seems very clear, but the individual models are much more complex. Some don't have the subpolar gyres. Some have a large center of action here up in the Jinsees. So I think I don't want to say anything more than some basic observations here because this is something that our group needs to discuss a little bit more. But we were sort of spitballing the other day and trying to think, well, maybe we could look at some low latitude, high latitude Gulf Stream sort of index if we can create an index that's more robust to that large trend from the global warming signal. Maybe we can identify a fingerprint that would work. So that's
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Hali? See, I see one in the chat box from Sunki Lee. Excellent talk. So the second SVD mode is AMO, and the first mode is AMOC. Do you think that we can use subpolar North Atlantic SST, global SST as a proxy for the AMOC mode?
Well, that's exactly sort of the problem here with this is depending on how you subtract the signal. I'm not sure that yeah, I'd like to say that eventually we'll be able to figure out how to get a clean signal that doesn't have the forced recent warming in it. But I think I certainly know I need to think about it a lot more. So.
And then I see a question from Tim Del Sol. Go ahead.
Hi, Hali. Nice talk. I didn't quite understand the reasoning behind comparing the slopes of the power spectra. So I'm aware that there are tests available for equality of power spectra. Is that something you would want, or is there something really special about the spectral slope that for some reason you were interested in?
The spectral slope really helps characterize the amount of lower frequency versus higher frequency variability. I mean, that's really what we're looking at. So if there were areas with a lot more low frequency variability, that might be as a proxy person, I'm like, oh, I want to target that if I want to reconstruct multi-decadal variability, but also or low frequency variability, but also just to understand sort of where certain processes are more active or more important in the ocean. So a totally somewhat different perspective, though, things like at low latitudes, Ackermann transport variability is driving AMOC. And so that's your winds are going to be a driver of that variance, and it's going to be different than, say, at different, you might see a difference in the frequency of variance depending on the process that's important. So I think that's really the point to do the spectral slopes, and it was just a metric to explore the data more than anything at this point.
So can I just ask a follow-up question?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not an expert in proxy data. I'm kind of curious, what is it that you want? How do you define consistency, right? Because you don't expect proxies to match SSTs exactly, right? And so when you're comparing with models, you have to forgive some differences. what do you consider like a successful example of consistency? Like the fact that these SVDs match up, or is there something more stringent test?
Ultimately, we would like to be able to essentially say that the proxies represent some variable of interest plus a little noise. I mean, that's true. And so it's really about characterizing the signal and then characterizing the noise and making sure your signal to noise ratios are fairly high. So I think there are different metrics you could use. And at this point, we haven't applied any metric. But certainly something with the SVD analysis that we've looked into is looking at sort of doing the basic SVD over a certain calibration window and then holding back some of the data to have a quantitative verification of your ability to reconstruct so that you can quantify your signal to noise ratio essentially in the reconstruction. How well are you characterizing the signal? And that's certainly for a work that would be actually doing a full reconstruction, you would want to include that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, any final questions for Hali? See, I don't see any movement here, and I do want to give time for Mike Patterson to make concluding remarks. So I think we'll end your presentation here. So I'll hand this off to Mike Patterson.
Hi, thanks, Jenny. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I want to take this opportunity, Jenny had suggested this, and I really appreciate her doing so, to thank on behalf of US CLIVAR and the UK RAPID programs, and to recognize the efforts of our 11 lead authors on the AGU special collection of review papers for the excellent presentations that they've provided to us over the last year. I think it's also important to thank all of you who have participated in this series. Of the 7 webinar series that US CLIVAR has undertaken in the past year, this one has been a standout in terms of its popularity, with a range of 60 today to well over 100 scientists tuning in. So we kind of hate to see this go, given its popularity. I also want to, and if you've missed any of the webinars, we have them all recorded or archived on our US CLIVAR YouTube. And Jenny, if you can just shoot out in the chat that link so that people will have that in case you want to go back and see something that you might have missed. I also want to recognize and thank Jenny for her expert support and dedication to organizing, promoting, and enabling the series. We really rely on such talent and expert organizational facilitation for the success here. So with the completion of this series, we're not done in sunsetting the US AMOC science team as it wraps up. This is perhaps one of several events and activities over the course of the next year. So I just want to remind everybody and thank everyone for submitting contributions to your project updates for the upcoming progress report that the Executive Committee will be working on and publish later this summer. And agencies will be happy to receive this update from the summarizing the activities over the last couple of years on the individual and projects that you've undertaken. And then we have the final US AMOC Science Team meeting set for next April, the 25th through 28th. If you haven't marked your calendar, please do so. The organizing committee has met several times, but with the postponement of that, we'll be getting underway again here, perhaps this fall, to get that moving again, abstracts open in advance so that everyone can participate. I want to make it very clear for you outside the US that this is very much open to international community participation. In fact, given that this is kind of the wrap up of the US AMOC science team, we really are going to be using this meeting to be forward looking in terms of remaining priorities within the international AMOC research community that need to be tackled going forward. So as we step away from the science team structure in the US, we do anticipate active support by our federal sponsors here in the US and continued engagement internationally to help develop the science and projects going forward. And then following that meeting, we'll have a final science team report next summer that will highlight those remaining priorities. It'll be forward-looking to help inform future investments. And I think to wrap up here, I'll just do a plug for a new development in case you weren't aware that International CLIVAR has newly established an AMOC task team being chaired by Eleanor Frederick Williams. That is now underway. It had its first meeting in March and is just now charting out its activities. Key aspects of this or terms of reference for this new team are to develop, I'm going to read off here, to develop strategies for cost-effective sustained monitoring of the AMOC, something that's still at risk. So carrying that forward under International CLIVAR, promoting and coordinating international collaborations amongst observational and modeling studies, so continuing that work, as well as organizing international workshops, so and science meetings downstream, so similar to what we've done with US AMOC and the UK RAPID program with our international meetings that we've both hosted. So AMOC science will continue forward. The momentum of this community will be sustained, particularly with CLIVAR now launching its new effort. And I just want to say thank you all for participating, and we look forward to your continued engagement over the course of the next year as we sunset our science team. Thank you all for participating.